My name is Mary Johnson, 67 years old, and for 30 years I taught English at Boston University. Last month, an envelope arrived with an expensive cream cardstock invitation inside. James Taylor was getting married. The same James who had been my most brilliant student. The same James who betrayed me and called me old and worthless to my face 20 years ago, and he had no idea I still had every cruel word he said preserved in a letter. Now I was invited to his wedding. If you want to know what happens when someone invites their enemy just to flaunt their success, let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Subscribe to hear more stories of justice served, and stay with me while I tell you how one letter changed everything. I built my life around words and stories. For 3 decades, I guided thousands of eager minds through the landscapes of American literature at Boston University. My specialty was 19th century women writers, those bold voices who carved space for themselves in a world that tried to silence them. How ironic that I would need their courage later in my own career. James Taylor arrived in my advanced writing seminar during my 18th year of teaching. I was 47 then, at the height of my career with 2 books published and a reputation as a demanding but nurturing professor. From the moment he sat down in the 3rd row center seat, I noticed something different about him. He had piercing blue eyes that seemed to absorb everything, a quick mind that jumped ahead of my questions, and a hunger for recognition that was almost palpable. His first essay on Hawthorne showed such insight that I asked him to stay after class. My office was my sanctuary walls lined with first editions. I had carefully collected over decades photographs of literary landmarks I had visited, and stacks of journals containing my published works. Your analysis of symbolism in the Scarlet Letter goes beyond what I typically see, even from graduate students. I told him, watching his expression carefully. Pride flickered across his face, but something else, too. A calculation. I dismissed it then. I just understand how people hide their true selves, he replied. Everyone wears a letter on their chest, Professor Johnson. Most people just keep theirs hidden. Over the next semester, our Tuesday afternoon meetings became a ritual. I cleared my schedule for him, turning away other students who sought those prime-time slots. We dissected texts together, and I showed him approaches to literary criticism I had developed throughout my career. I shared unpublished notes, theories I was working on for my next book. He absorbed everything like a sponge. When the department announced its annual student writing competition, I spent extra hours helping James refine his submission, neglecting my own research. The piece explored power dynamics in educational institutions, ironically enough using frameworks I had taught him. When he won, I felt a sense of accomplishment, almost maternal in its intensity. "I could never have done this without you, Professor Johnson," he said at the awards reception. His arm around my shoulders as a photographer captured the moment for the university newsletter. "You saw something in me no one else did." The department chair noticed our connection. "Mary, you have not championed a student like this since Thomas Brighton 15 years ago." And he went on to Princeton. "James is different," I said confidently. "He has that special combination of brilliance and determination. He just needs guidance." When the prestigious Oxford summer program announced they had 2 openings for American students, I wrote such a glowing recommendation that the program director called me personally. "If you vouch for him this strongly, Mary, we will make room," she said. I even loaned James books from my personal collection, first editions I had spent years tracking down. My colleagues raised eyebrows at my investment in him, but I waved away their concerns. "You will see," I told them. "He represents the future of literary criticism. He just needs someone to open the doors." The pinnacle of my advocacy came when a teaching assistant position opened in our department. These positions were typically reserved for doctoral students, but I convinced the committee to consider James, though he was only in his final undergraduate year. His perspective would bring fresh energy to the introductory courses I argued during the faculty meeting, and working alongside experienced professors would prepare him for graduate studies. The committee agreed largely on the strength of my recommendation. James would begin the following semester primarily assisting with my American Literature Survey course. "I have arranged for you to have access to all my teaching materials," I told him excitedly. "My lecture notes, assignment structures, everything I have developed over 2 decades. His smile did not quite reach his eyes, but I attributed that to his natural reserve. How completely I misread him. How thoroughly I was setting the stage for my own professional humiliation. "This opportunity means everything to me, Professor Johnson," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I will make you proud." And I believed him. With my whole heart, I believed that I was cultivating a brilliant mind who would carry forward the traditions and values I had dedicated my life to upholding. I had no idea I was nurturing a viper who would turn on me with devastating precision. The first sign that something was amiss came in such a small way that I nearly missed it. The English Department Journal published an article James had written expanding on work we had developed together during our Tuesday sessions. I eagerly flipped to the acknowledgments section, expecting to see my name prominently featured. There was nothing. Not even a passing mention of my guidance or the theoretical framework I had shared with him. Probably an editorial oversight, I told myself, though a small knot formed in my stomach. At the faculty dinner celebrating the journal publication, James circulated among my colleagues with newfound confidence. I overheard him explaining his methodology to Professor Wilson from Comparative Literature. "The approach examines power structures embedded in narrative voice," he said smoothly. "I developed it while studying patterns across multiple texts." I nearly choked on my wine. That was my methodology, one I had shared with him from my upcoming book manuscript. I had even shown him my draft chapters. Now he spoke as if it were entirely his creation. When I approached him later that evening, he skillfully redirected the conversation. "Professor Johnson, I was just telling Dean Roberts about the summer program at Oxford. The acceptance letter arrived today." The dean beamed at me. "Your protégé continues to impress Mary." The subject of attribution was lost in congratulations, exactly as James had intended. Over the next few weeks, James began canceling our Tuesday sessions. First, it was a conflicting study group, then extra research at the library, finally no explanation at all. The empty hour in my schedule felt like a small betrayal each week. During a department meeting where I presented my proposal for expanding the American Women Writers section of the curriculum, I noticed James whispering to a younger faculty member. When I finished, he raised his hand. "While Professor Johnson's proposal has historical merit," he said, emphasizing historical in a way that suggested outdated students today are looking for more diverse perspectives that connect to contemporary issues. The room fell silent. He had never publicly disagreed with me before, let alone in a way that subtly positioned me as behind the times. Several younger faculty members nodded in agreement with him. Later that week, I overheard him in the graduate student lounge holding court with students who had once sought my mentorship. "The traditional approaches have value as foundation," he was saying, "but serious scholars need to move beyond those limited frameworks." When one student mentioned my name, I heard him respond, "Professor Johnson represents a certain era of literary criticism. Some of us are looking toward the future." The statement burned like acid. I had given him access to everything I knew, everything I had built over decades, and now he was positioning himself as the progressive voice while relegating me to the past. The worst betrayal came when I received a copy of the undergraduate literary journal. Featured prominently was James' new article, which contained 3 paragraphs that were nearly identical to passages from my unpublished manuscript. They were reworded just enough to avoid direct plagiarism, but the ideas, the structure, even some unique phrases, were unmistakably mine. I confronted him after class manuscript, pages in hand. These concepts are remarkably similar to my work, James. Work I shared with you in confidence. He glanced at the papers with a dismissive smile. Great minds often develop parallel thinking, Professor. These ideas have been circulating in academic circles for years. Not these specific interpretations, I insisted, pointing to a unique framework I had developed for analyzing narrative unreliability. This approach is distinctly mine. He shrugged, gathering his books. I have sources for all my work. Perhaps you came across similar articles in your research. The implication that I might have been the one copying from others left me speechless. By the time I formulated a response, he was already walking away, mentioning a meeting he could not miss. My unease grew when I learned James had begun meeting privately with the department chair, discussing what he called modernizing approaches to the curriculum. These were meetings I, as senior faculty, should have been included in. Instead, decisions were being made without my input, often contradicting approaches I had carefully developed. During a curriculum committee meeting, James contradicted me directly when I suggested maintaining our focus on close textual analysis. With all due respect to Professor Johnson's established methods, he said, his voice carrying the perfect note of respectful disagreement that nonetheless undermined me. Completely, students need more culturally responsive approaches that connect texts to contemporary social dynamics. Several committee members voiced immediate support for his position, leaving me feeling suddenly invisible in a room where my expertise had once been valued above all others. Despite these warning signs, I continued defending James to skeptical colleagues. Professor Harrington, who had witnessed James' treatment of me in meetings, expressed concern. "Mary, I do not think your protégé returns your high regard," she said gently. "Perhaps you should be more cautious about what you share with him. He is just finding his voice," I insisted, though doubt had taken root firmly in my mind. All brilliant students need to establish independence from their mentors. I later discovered James had been privately meeting with the dean about what he called refreshing the program, my program, the one I had spent 30 years building, and he was positioning himself as the agent of necessary change while portraying my life's work as something outdated that needed replacement. The betrayal cut deeper because I had opened every door for him, shared every resource, and championed him even when my instincts began sending warnings. I had made him what he was, and now he was using that position to systematically dismantle my academic standing. As my 30th year of teaching approached, I announced my intention to retire in 2 years. I wanted a proper transition time to finish my current book and see one final class of students through their degrees. What should have been a dignified culmination of a distinguished career instead became the catalyst for James's most calculated moves against me. The department naturally began discussions about my replacement, forming a committee to outline the desired qualifications and focus for the position. Though still 2 years away, these conversations would shape the future direction of my life's work. I assumed I would be central to these discussions. I was wrong. James had positioned himself strategically. As my former teaching assistant, now risen to adjunct professor status, thanks to my recommendations, He had unique insight into my courses, my research, and my role in the department. He used this knowledge like a weapon. While sorting through department emails incorrectly sent to me, I discovered messages where James had been systematically undermining my teaching methods to administration. One email to the Academic Affairs Director described my approaches as foundational but increasingly obsolete in the modern academic landscape. Another suggested my research methodologies were museum pieces rather than living scholarship. Each message was crafted with superficial respect while delivering devastating professional assessments. He praised my historical contributions while emphatically arguing that the department needed to move in directions that explicitly rejected my approaches. During a junior faculty luncheon I had not been invited to, James spoke about necessary evolution away from traditional frameworks that no longer serve our students. A sympathetic colleague reported this to me, noting that everyone understood he was referring to my curriculum. The exclusion became more obvious as weeks passed. Meetings were scheduled during my teaching hours. My input on curriculum changes was solicited after decisions had essentially been made. When I submitted proposals, they were acknowledged politely, then effectively shelved. Perhaps most painful was watching James systematically dismantle the signature seminar I had developed over 20 years, my course on women's narrative voices in 19th century literature. As part of succession planning, the department chair suggested James take over one section while I continued teaching the other. "This will ensure continuity after your retirement," she explained, not meeting my eyes. Within one semester, James had completely restructured the reading list, the assignment sequence, and the theoretical approach. Students began switching from my section to his, attracted by what was described as a fresh perspective and contemporary relevance. My classroom, once filled to capacity with eager students, now held scattered attendees who often seemed to be comparing my teaching unfavorably to his. During department meetings, younger faculty increasingly deferred to James, rather than me, on matters of curriculum and theory, despite my decades of experience. They sought his approval for proposals and looked to him for validation of ideas. I became a ghost in my own department, present but increasingly unseen. The isolation grew as colleagues began treating me as if I had already left speaking of my contributions in the past tense. At a faculty reception, I overheard the department secretary telling a new instructor that corner office will be available once Professor Johnson leaves. James has already expressed interest in it. I was still 2 years from retirement, yet they were already parceling out my space, my position, my legacy. Most devastating was discovering that James had drafted a comprehensive proposal titled Department Direction 2000, and beyond that, explicitly argued for moving away from outdated perspectives that have dominated our curriculum. The document, which had been circulated among key decision-makers without my knowledge specifically critiqued, approaches identical to mine while presenting his alternatives as the necessary evolution. "While we honor the scholarly traditions of the past," he wrote, "we must recognize that fresh blood and contemporary perspectives are essential if our department is to remain relevant." Fresh blood. As if my continuing presence was a contamination to be purged. I learned that James had even approached the alumni donors who funded the Mary Johnson Scholarship I had established for students studying women's literature. He suggested broadening the scholarship's focus to include what he called more diverse perspectives, effectively diluting the specific purpose I had created it for. The donors seemed receptive, my colleague Thomas told me quietly. He can be very persuasive when presenting himself as the voice of academic progress. The scholarship had been my pride, a way to ensure my values continued supporting students even after my departure. Now James was systematically erasing even this legacy. Each day brought new evidence of his campaign. My research assistant requested reassignment to work with James instead. Conference panels I had always been invited to suddenly had new direction themes that excluded my expertise. Academic journals began returning my submissions with suggestions that I consider more current theoretical frameworks. Frameworks suspiciously similar to those James now claimed as his own. The pain was not merely professional, it was deeply personal. I had invested in James as if he were the academic son I never had. I had seen in him the continuation of my life's work, the assurance that what I valued would continue after me. Instead, he was systematically dismantling everything I had built, positioning himself as the necessary correction to my supposedly outdated approaches. "You seem withdrawn lately," observed Professor Harrington, now one of my few remaining allies. "Is everything all right?" Just focusing on my book, I lied, unable to admit how thoroughly I had been outmaneuvered by my own protégé. The humiliation was too complete, too all-encompassing to acknowledge even to a friend. What James could not possibly understand was that he was not merely pushing aside an old professor to advance his career. He was erasing a life's work, devaluing decades of scholarship, and dismissing the very real contributions I had made to our field. He was teaching the academic world that my voice did not matter, that my perspectives were disposable, that I was in essence already gone. And I was beginning to believe him. The final betrayal came on an unseasonably cold April morning. I arrived early to prepare for my seminar, relishing the quiet moments in my office before students filled the hallways. A manila envelope sat in my faculty mailbox unmarked except for my name typed on a plain label. Inside was a copy of a confidential department recommendation that had accidentally been included in materials meant for someone else. It was a formal assessment written by James for the university's long-term planning committee, evaluating the current strengths and weaknesses of our English department. My hands trembled as I read his clinical dissection of my teaching and research contributions. While Professor Johnson's historical contributions are acknowledged, her continued presence represents a significant obstacle to necessary departmental evolution. Her methodologies, once standard but now increasingly questioned in contemporary scholarship, create inconsistencies in our curriculum. Students exposed to her courses often require substantial reorientation to more current approaches, effectively creating remedial work for other faculty. Her resistance to methodological innovation has become a burden on departmental resources and risks our standing among peer institutions. As we plan for her upcoming retirement, I strongly recommend immediate steps to minimize her influence on curriculum development and student advisement to facilitate a smoother transition to more relevant academic approaches. The words blurred through my tears. This was not merely professional disagreement. This was character assassination disguised as academic assessment. This was a deliberate effort to nullify my remaining time at the university and erase my 3 decades of contribution. I made photocopies of the document, my mind strangely calm despite the storm raging inside me. Then I waited. James had a meeting in the adjacent conference room that would end at 11. I sat at my desk, the betrayal before me, in black and white, and prepared for the confrontation I could no longer avoid. When he passed my open door, I called his name. "James, do you have a moment?" His smile was perfectly pleasant as he stepped into my office. "Of course, Professor Johnson, though I have a student meeting at 11:30. I closed the door behind him and placed the recommendation letter on my desk, turned so he could read it. "I believe this was meant to remain confidential," I said quietly. His expression flickered for just an instant before smoothing into concerned professionalism. Where did you get this? That's your first question, not an explanation or apology for what you wrote. These assessments require complete candor, he said, his tone shifting to one of practiced patience. They're not meant for the subjects being evaluated. Subjects, I repeated. Is that what I am to you now? A subject to be evaluated and found wanting. You're taking this too personally, he said, checking his watch. This is about departmental direction, not you specifically. You wrote that my presence is an obstacle, that students need remediation after my courses, that I should be immediately sidelined despite my remaining time here. My voice remained steady through years of classroom discipline. How is that not specifically about me? Something changed in his expression then. The mask of respect he had maintained, even while undermining me, finally slipped completely away. What emerged was something cold and calculating I had never seen before, though perhaps it had always been there beneath the surface. Fine, he said, his voice hardening. You want honesty. Yes, you're an obstacle. You and your outdated theories and your precious 19th century women no one reads anymore. You're holding back an entire department with your sentimentality and your resistance to change. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the verbal assault. Do you know what students call you behind your back? The relic? They take your courses because they're required or because they're easy. As for anyone willing to regurgitate your tired perspectives, they laugh about it. About you. Each word struck like a physical blow, but I forced myself to maintain eye contact, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of looking away. I've spent 3 years working around you, trying to salvage what I could of this department's reputation, while you cling to your position and your precious legacy. A legacy no one will remember 5 years after you're gone. Is that why you took so much from me? I asked quietly. My research, my methodologies, my connections to build your career on what you claim is worthless. His laugh was genuine but cruel. I took what was useful and discarded the rest. That's how evolution works, Professor. The strong adapt and survive. The weak get left behind. And our relationship, the mentorship, the trust, my voice finally betrayed a tremor, a means to an end. He leaned forward, all pretense abandoned. Did you really think I valued you, that I saw you as anything more than a stepping stone? You were useful until you weren't. Your neediness, your maternal instincts toward me, your desperate desire for some kind of academic offspring, it was all so easy to manipulate. The room seemed to tilt slightly. I gripped the edge of my desk to steady myself. You're old and worthless now, Mary, he said, using my first name for the first time ever, a final degradation. Your kind of scholarship is a museum piece. Your teaching methods are holding students back from what they actually need to learn. Your presence here is nothing but a sentimental accommodation that drains resources from more valuable pursuits. He gathered his papers, straightening his tie, as if we had just concluded a normal meeting. The department has tolerated you out of respect for your past contributions, but make no mistake, everyone is simply waiting for you to leave. I'm just the only one honest enough to say it to your face. At the door, he paused. I would suggest you fade away quietly. Cancel your remaining conference appearances. Withdraw from committee assignments. Focus on your retirement planning. It would be less embarrassing for everyone, especially you. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded like the period at the end of my career. I sat motionless, his words echoing in the suddenly too large office. Old, worthless, obstacle. Museum piece. Relic. Outside my window, students cross the quad, laughing in the spring sunshine, unaware of the academic execution that had just taken place in my book-lined office. My sanctuary was now a crime scene where my professional identity had been methodically murdered by the very person I had championed, nurtured, and believed in. The betrayal was so complete, so perfectly orchestrated, that for several minutes I could only sit in stunned silence, trying to comprehend how thoroughly I had misread both James and my own standing in the academic world I had devoted my life to serving. After James left, I remained at my desk for nearly an hour, perfectly still, as if movement might shatter me completely. When I finally stirred, my first action was deliberate and careful. I took out a sheet of heavy cream stationery, the kind I reserved for important correspondence, and began writing. I recorded every word James had said to me, every cruel phrase and dismissive assessment while they were still fresh in my memory. I dated the letter, signed it, and sealed it in an envelope which I locked in my desk drawer. Some part of me knew this record might matter someday, though I had no concept then of how or when. It was simply my scholarly habit to document what seemed significant, even when that significance was my own professional execution. The following weeks passed in a fog of humiliation and grief. I canceled my remaining classes that week, citing a sudden illness, unable to face students, while wondering if they really did mock me behind my back. When I returned the following Monday, I moved through my lectures mechanically, a ghost teaching ghost subjects, according to James. The department chair called me to her office, concern evident in her expression. "Mary, is everything all right? Students mentioned, your lectures seem diminished." I considered telling her about James's true nature, showing her the assessment he had written, repeating his cruel words. But the thought of recounting my humiliation of potentially being met with agreement rather than support was unbearable. "Just tired," I said instead. "Perhaps I should accelerate my retirement plans." Her relief was poorly concealed. "If you think that's best. We could arrange for a mid-year transition, rather than waiting until next spring." "I'll consider it," I replied, understanding that the decision had effectively been made. That afternoon I began packing my office, 3 decades of academic life, distilled into cardboard boxes. Each book represented courses, taught each folder contained student work. I had carefully guided each framed certificate, marked professional recognition, now apparently rendered obsolete. Thomas Brighton, a longtime colleague who had watched my relationship with James develop, stopped by as I wrapped my first edition of The Scarlet Letter in protective paper. "Mary, what are you doing? You're not leaving for months yet." "Getting a head start," I said, not meeting his eyes. 30 years accumulates a lot of artifacts. I deliberately used James's dismissive terminology for my career. Thomas sat down, moving aside a stack of literary journals. "What happened? Something changed. I know you too well to believe this is routine preparation." Perhaps it was his genuine concern, or simply the need to unburden myself to someone, but I found the story pouring out. James's systematic betrayal, the confidential assessment, the final cruel confrontation. As I spoke, tears came for the first time, not delicate drops, but racking sobs that bent me double in my chair. I gave him everything I gasped between sobs, my knowledge, my connections, my trust. And he called me old and worthless to my face. Thomas's expression darkened with each detail. "This is academic misconduct, Mary. Plagiarism of your ideas, sabotage, creating a hostile work environment. We should report him to the ethics committee." I shook my head, wiping tears with the back of my hand. And say what? That my protege hurt my feelings. That he thinks I'm outdated, I'd only confirm his assessment of me as a sentimental old woman unable to accept changing academic standards. This isn't about changing standards, Thomas insisted. This is about character and basic professional ethics. But I had already begun withdrawing from department functions, making myself scarce to avoid further humiliation. I stopped attending faculty meetings, sending brief emails with any essential input. I took to eating lunch in my car rather than the faculty dining room, where I might encounter James or colleagues who shared his assessment of me. Depression settled over me like a heavy cloak. I questioned every course I had taught, every paper I had published, every student I had mentored. Had my entire career been a self-deception? Was I truly the obstacle to progress that James had portrayed me as? The questions circled endlessly, robbing me of sleep and draining what little professional confidence remained. The turning point came unexpectedly through a former student. Amelia Parker had taken my Women Writers seminar 12 years earlier and now taught at a small liberal arts college in Vermont. Her email arrived on a particularly dark day when I had been contemplating simply not returning to campus at all. "Professor Johnson," she wrote, "I'm designing a course on female narrative voice and found myself returning to the framework you taught us. Your approach fundamentally shaped how I understand literature and how I teach it to my students. I wanted you to know that your insights continue to influence a new generation of scholars, including the 30 students in my classroom this semester." Attached was her course syllabus, which credited me prominently and built upon methodologies I had developed. I read it with tears streaming down my face, but these were different from the bitter tears of betrayal. These were the first healing drops of validation. The email prompted me to reach out to other former students tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Their responses overwhelmed me. Lawyers who still quoted Hawthorne in their arguments, journalists who approached their stories with the critical analysis I had taught them, teachers who had adapted my classroom techniques for their own students, even a best-selling novelist who credited my feedback on her undergraduate stories with giving her the confidence to pursue writing professionally. None of them saw me as a relic. None dismissed my contributions as museum pieces. In their eyes, I was not worthless but valuable, not an obstacle but a bridge that had helped them cross from uncertainty to confidence in their own voices. "I still have the paper you commented on in sophomore year," wrote Michael Tanner, now an editor at a major publishing house. "Your note saying my perspective was worth developing gave me the courage to pursue my current career. I look at it whenever I doubt myself." Slowly, painfully, I began reconstructing my sense of professional worth outside the toxic environment James had created in my department. I reduced my university responsibilities to just my required courses, pouring my remaining energy into a community literature program for adults returning to education. There, away from academia's politics and hierarchies, I found students genuinely hungry for the knowledge I could share. The director of the community program, Grace Williams, became a new friend and advocate. "These students value your decades of experience," she told me after observing one of my sessions. "They understand that wisdom isn't outdated, it's essential." During this period, I also connected with a small independent publisher interested in the book manuscript I had long delayed completing. Barbara Simmons, the senior editor, saw value precisely where James had seen irrelevance. "Your analysis of narrative unreliability in women's literature offers insights no one else has articulated," she told me over coffee. "The academic world needs this perspective, regardless of shifting trends." With her encouragement, I finished the manuscript that summer working in my home office, surrounded by the books and research materials I had rescued from my university office. The writing became a form of reclamation, each page an assertion that my voice still mattered, my insights still held value. When the first printed copy arrived 9 months later, I ran my fingers over my name on the cover, tangible proof of my continued relevance in a world that had tried to discard me. I sent copies to former students and colleagues who had supported me, but not to my department. That chapter of my life was closing, and I was gradually finding peace in letting it go. 3 years passed in this way. My formal retirement from the university happened quietly, with a small reception, attended primarily by administrative staff and a few loyal colleagues. James did not attend, though he sent a perfectly appropriate card with professionally cordial sentiments. By then, I had heard he had secured a prestigious position within the department and was engaged to Sophia Montgomery, daughter of the university's largest donor. The wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, elegantly addressed to Professor Mary Johnson. Inside expensive cardstock announced the union of James Taylor and Sophia Montgomery at the Boston Harbor Hotel, with a reception to follow. A handwritten note from James was included. "Professor Johnson, your presence would mean a great deal as I begin this new chapter. Your influence on my career has been significant. James." I stared at the invitation for a long time, understanding perfectly what it represented. This was not reconciliation or genuine respect. This was a victory lap. James was inviting me to witness his complete triumph, his perfect narrative of success that required my presence as the aging mentor, gracefully giving way to her superior replacement. What he could not know was that during those 3 years I had finally found my voice again, and I still had the letter. The wedding invitation sat on my kitchen table for 3 days while I contemplated its meaning. Everything about it was calculated, from the heavy cardstock that spoke of wealth to the carefully worded note that acknowledged my influence without specifying its nature. James wanted me there not as an honored guest, but as a prop in his narrative of success, the aging professor whose approval would validate his rise. My first instinct was to decline politely or simply not respond. Why subject myself to further humiliation by attending the celebration of someone who had systematically dismantled my professional standing? Then I noticed the small details. The wedding would take place at the Boston Harbor Hotel, one of the most exclusive venues in the city. The Montgomery family name headlined the invitation, positioned prominently above James's. Several university trustees were listed as honorary hosts. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a networking event, a public cementing of James's new position in both academia and Boston's society. Curiosity led me to research Sophia Montgomery. Her father, Richard Montgomery, was not merely a university donor, but a trustee with significant influence over faculty appointments and departmental funding. Sophia herself had graduated from Harvard with honors and now worked for her father's foundation, overseeing educational grants. They were academic royalty in Boston, and James had somehow positioned himself to join their family. I called Thomas, who had remained a friend after his own retirement from the university. "James Taylor is marrying Sophia Montgomery," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "That's an unexpected match. The Montgomerys are old Boston academic establishment. They typically stay within their social circle." "What do you know about how they met?" I asked. "Only campus rumors," Thomas replied. Apparently, James impressed Richard Montgomery during a fundraising event by presenting himself as a self-made academic success story. "You know, brilliant student from modest background who rose through sheer talent and hard work. The irony was almost physically painful. James, who had built his career by appropriating my work and connections, was now presenting himself as self-made. The narrative he had constructed so carefully had no place for the truth about how doors had been opened for him or whose ideas had formed the foundation of his early success. "Have you heard anything about his current standing in the department?" I asked. Thomas hesitated. "Mary, are you sure you want to know?" "Please," I said. "I need to understand what I'm dealing with." "He's being fast-tracked for department chair when Sarah retires next year," Thomas said reluctantly. "And he's continued his pattern. 2 junior faculty members have left after he apparently took credit for their research and grant applications. But no one challenges him openly because of his connection to the Montgomery funding." After we hung up, I retrieved the sealed letter from my desk drawer, the one in which I had recorded James's exact words from our final confrontation. "Old and worthless. Museum piece. Sentimental accommodation." The cruel phrases had lost some of their power to wound me, but they remained a perfect record of his true character, a character the Montgomerys and the university trustees certainly knew nothing about. For the first time, I considered attending the wedding, not as the defeated former mentor, but as someone with unique knowledge that might be relevant to a bride about to commit her life to a man capable of extraordinary cruelty and calculation. The moral questions weighed heavily on me. Did Sophia deserve to know who she was really marrying? Did the academic community deserve to know the true nature of the man being elevated to positions of increasing authority? Or was I simply seeking revenge, a final opportunity to strike back at someone who had hurt me deeply? I needed more information before making my decision. Through discreet inquiries to former colleagues, I learned that several department members would be attending the wedding, including people who had witnessed James's treatment of me. I also discovered that James had been claiming credit for initiatives I had started, including the Women Writers Scholarship Program he had once dismissed as irrelevant. Most significantly, I learned from Grace at the Community Literature Program that Sophia Montgomery had a reputation for valuing authenticity and ethical behavior in both personal and professional relationships. Her foundation had recently withdrawn funding from an arts organization when its director was found to have misrepresented his credentials. She has a zero-tolerance policy for dishonesty. Grace told me unaware of my interest in this information. Apparently, she ended a previous engagement when she discovered her fiancé had lied about his academic background. This final piece of information clarified my decision. I called Thomas again. "I'm going to attend James's wedding," I said without preamble. "Mary, are you sure that's wise? It might be painful to watch him celebrate after how he treated you." "I'm not going to disrupt anything," I assured him, though that wasn't entirely true. "I just feel I should be there, for closure, if nothing else." "Would you like me to accompany you, Sarah?" And I received invitations as well. I accepted gratefully, knowing that having supportive friends present would strengthen my resolve for what I was considering. Over the next 2 weeks, I prepared carefully. I had the letter notarized, making it a legal document that could not be dismissed as the fabrication of a bitter former colleague. I practiced what I might say, if given the opportunity, focusing on facts rather than emotions. I chose a dignified navy blue dress that conveyed professional confidence rather than festive celebration. Most importantly, I worked on my own emotional state. The woman who had collapsed in tears after James's attack 3 years ago no longer existed. In her place was someone who had rebuilt her sense of worth, independent of departmental politics. Someone who had found new avenues for her knowledge and new communities that valued her contributions. The morning of the wedding, I stood before my mirror, assessing the woman who looked back at me. At 67, I was no longer young, but neither was I the academic relic James had described. My silver hair was styled in a modern bob, my posture straight, my eyes clear, with purpose, rather than clouded with humiliation. "You have nothing to be ashamed of," I told my reflection. "You built a career of integrity. You helped hundreds of students find their voices. You have value that cannot be diminished by someone else's cruelty." As I slid the letter into my handbag, I felt a surprising sense of calm. Whatever happened today, I was no longer a victim. I was a witness to truth, carrying a record of words that revealed character in its most unguarded moment. Whether I would share that record remained to be seen, but having it with me transformed me from powerless to powerful. I was no longer going to James's wedding as someone seeking approval or validation. I was going as someone who carried truth, who had found her voice again, and who understood that sometimes justice requires nothing more than allowing someone's true nature to be seen clearly by those who need to see it. Thomas and Sarah picked me up promptly at 11, both dressed elegantly, but with the slight awkwardness of academics more comfortable in lecture halls than social events. "You look different," Mary Sarah commented, as we drove toward Boston Harbor. "More present somehow." I smiled, feeling the letter in my bag like a talisman. I feel different. For the first time in years, I feel completely myself. As our car approached the hotel entrance, Thomas squeezed my hand. "Whatever happens today, remember, you have people who know your true worth." I nodded, grateful for his support, but suddenly certain I no longer needed it. The Mary Johnson, who had been destroyed by James's cruelty, was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who understood that worth comes not from others' assessments, but from the integrity with which one lives one's life. And I was about to carry that understanding into the celebration of a man who had never grasped that essential truth. The Boston Harbor Hotel gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, its arched windows overlooking the water where sailboats drifted lazily in the summer breeze. A doorman directed us to the grand ballroom, where white orchids and silver candelabras transformed the space into something from a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic patterns across tables covered in silk and adorned with hand-calligraphed place cards. This was clearly no ordinary academic wedding. The Montgomery family had spared no expense in creating a showcase event that spoke of old money established position and unquestioned social standing. Everything James had clearly been aspiring to when he systematically removed me as an obstacle to his ambitions. Thomas, Sarah, and I found our table near the back of the room as befitted our status as professional connections rather than close friends or family. Several colleagues from the university nodded in greeting their expressions, ranging from surprise at my presence to uncomfortable recognition of the awkwardness inherent in the situation. Professor Harrington whispered to me, "I didn't expect to see you here, Mary. That shows remarkable grace on your part." If only she knew the letter resting in my handbag contained nothing resembling grace, only the unvarnished record of cruelty that had altered the course of my final years at the university. The ceremony itself was beautiful in its carefully orchestrated perfection. James, handsome, in a tailored tuxedo, stood at the altar looking every inch the successful academic he had positioned himself to be. When Sophia appeared in a gown that probably cost more than my annual salary, I had to acknowledge they made a striking couple. She was tall and elegant, with the confident posture of someone who had never questioned her place in the world. As they exchanged vows, I studied their expressions. James performed sincerity perfectly, his voice catching at exactly the right moments, his eyes conveying exactly the right degree of emotion. I wondered if Sophia could see through the performance, or if she, like me years ago, saw only what he wanted her to see. The reception began with cocktails and carefully choreographed mingling. I stayed close to Thomas and Sarah, declining opportunities to circulate among university colleagues who had witnessed my professional dismantling. Then James spotted me across the room. He excused himself from a conversation with what appeared to be university trustees and approached our table with Sophia on his arm. "Professor Johnson," he said, his voice warm, with precisely calibrated respect. "I'm so pleased you could come. This means a great deal to me." His eyes held no recognition of our last conversation, no acknowledgement of the words he had hurled at me in my office. In his narrative, perhaps that confrontation had never happened or had been recast as a respectful professional disagreement. "Congratulations," I replied, my voice steady. "Sophia, this is Professor Mary Johnson, my undergraduate mentor at Boston University," he said, performing the introduction as if bestowing an honor upon me. Much of my early academic success can be attributed to her guidance. Sophia extended her hand with the practiced grace of someone raised in high society. "James speaks very highly of you, Professor Johnson. He says you recognized his potential before anyone else." "I saw something in him, certainly," I replied, the double meaning, clear only to myself and perhaps to James, whose smile flickered almost imperceptibly. Professor Johnson recently published an excellent book on narrative unreliability in 19th century literature, James added smoothly, as if he hadn't once dismissed that very work as irrelevant museum pieces. Her insights continue to influence the field. The conversation continued in this vein, a perfect performance of respectful collegiality that bore no relationship to reality. I maintained my composure, responding with appropriate pleasantries, while the weight of the letter in my bag seemed to grow heavier with each false word. When they moved on to greet other guests, Thomas whispered, "He's quite the actor. You would never know from that interaction that he systematically undermined your entire career." "That's his true talent," I replied, "creating narratives that serve his purposes regardless of their relationship to truth." The reception proceeded to dinner, where crystal glasses clinked and polite conversation flowed around topics carefully selected to avoid controversy. From my position near the back of the room, I observed James working the crowd masterfully, adjusting his persona slightly for each group: business executives, academic administrators, Sophia's family friends. He was a chameleon, becoming whatever the viewer wanted to see. After the meal came the expected toasts. Sophia's father spoke first, a commanding figure whose approval James had clearly worked hard to secure. Then James's best man, a colleague from the department, who praised his meteoric rise and innovative thinking without mentioning whose ideas had formed the foundation of that supposed innovation. Finally, James himself stood, champagne glass raised. The room fell silent as he began a speech clearly designed to cement his narrative of self-made success. "As many of you know, I came to Boston University with little more than ambition and determination." He began, conveniently omitting the full scholarship and departmental support he had received. "Through hard work and a willingness to challenge established thinking, I found my academic voice." I felt a tightening in my chest as he continued describing research breakthroughs that had originated in our Tuesday afternoon sessions, presenting methodologies I had developed as his own discoveries, portraying himself as a revolutionary thinker who had overcome institutional resistance rather than someone who had been given every advantage and support. Then he turned toward my table, his expression perfectly calibrated to convey respectful acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge my former professor, Mary Johnson, who has joined us today. He gestured in my direction as heads turned to locate me. Professor Johnson represents an academic tradition from which I learned valuable lessons, even as my own work necessarily moved in different directions. The careful phrasing was exquisite in its calculated dismissal disguised as respect. I was positioned as the outdated tradition, the stepping stone now rendered obsolete by his superior insights. And he was doing it publicly in front of Boston's academic elite, rewriting our history, while I sat as a silent prop in his narrative. In that moment, all my careful planning, all my questions about whether to speak or remain silent, crystallized into absolute clarity. This was not about revenge. It was about truth, in a room full of carefully constructed fiction. I stood my movement, causing a small ripple of surprised murmurs. James's expression flickered with momentary uncertainty before he recovered. "Professor Johnson, would you like to add something? We would be honored to hear from you." His tone suggested he expected perhaps a brief, congratulatory comment, a final public capitulation to his narrative. "Thank you, James," I said, my voice stronger than I had anticipated. "I would indeed like to say a few words." I moved toward the front of the room, aware of every eye upon me, the letter now in my hand, rather than my purse. The walk seemed both endless and instantaneous. For those who don't know me, I am Mary Johnson. I taught American literature at Boston University for 30 years before retiring 3 years ago. I paused, making eye contact with various guests. James was indeed my student, and as he mentioned, I recognized something in him immediately. James's smile remained fixed, though tension had entered his posture. Sophia watched with polite interest, unaware of what was coming. What James has not mentioned is the nature of our last conversation before my retirement. I continued, my voice steady. A conversation I found so significant that I recorded his exact words immediately afterward in this letter, which I have kept for 3 years. The room went completely still. James took a half-step forward as if to intervene, but social convention prevented him from interrupting a speaking guest, particularly an elderly former professor. In that conversation, after I discovered he had written a confidential assessment calling for my immediate removal from department responsibilities, James expressed his true feelings about me and my work. I would like to share his exact words with you all, particularly with you, Sophia, as you prepare to build a life with him. I unfolded the letter, my hands steady now. James told me, and I quote, "You're old and worthless now, Mary. Your kind of scholarship is a museum piece. Your teaching methods are holding students back from what they actually need to learn. Your presence here is nothing but a sentimental accommodation that drains resources from more valuable pursuits." A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Sophia's expression transformed from polite interest to shocked disbelief. He further stated, "Did you really think I valued you, that I saw you as anything more than a stepping stone? You were useful until you weren't. Your neediness, your maternal instincts toward me, your desperate desire for some kind of academic offspring, it was all so easy to manipulate." James finally found his voice. "Professor Johnson is clearly confused. This is a complete fabrication born of professional jealousy, and—" "The letter is notarized," James I interjected calmly. "Dated the day of our conversation. And there were other witnesses to your pattern of behavior, some of whom are in this room." I looked directly at Sophia, whose complexion had paled considerably. I debated whether to share this today. But I believe that when building a life with someone, it's essential to know their true character. The person James showed you, and the person he revealed to me when he no longer needed me, cannot both be true. James attempted damage control his voice, taking on the reasonable tone he had perfected for departmental disagreements. Professor Johnson misinterpreted a professional disagreement about departmental direction. Her memory of our conversation is clearly colored by emotional. Is it your position that you never called me old and worthless to my face? I interrupted my voice, still calm but firm. That you never described manipulating my maternal instincts toward you. That you never told me to fade away quietly because everyone was simply waiting for me to leave. His momentary silence was damning. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Academic disagreements can sometimes become heated. He began, but Sophia had already turned toward him, her expression a mixture of disgust and dawning comprehension. "Is this true, James?" she asked quietly. "Did you say these things to a woman who mentored you?" His response was to attempt to take her hand, which she withdrew. "Darling, this is hardly the venue to discuss departmental politics from years ago. Professor Johnson clearly has some unresolved." "Answer me," Sophia insisted, her voice carrying in the silent room. "Did you say these things?" Thomas stood from our table. He said them, Miss Montgomery, and worse. His treatment of Professor Johnson was well known in the department, though few had the courage to challenge him directly given his rising influence. Professor Harrington joined him. I witnessed his systematic undermining of Mary's position over several years. What she has described is entirely consistent with behavior many of us observed. The beautiful fairy tale wedding had transformed into something entirely different. Guests watched in stunned silence as the carefully constructed narrative collapsed under the weight of simple truth. I refolded the letter and placed it on the nearest table. I didn't come here seeking revenge, James. I came because truth matters. Character matters. How we treat people when we no longer need them reveals who we truly are. I turned to Sophia, whose eyes had filled with tears. "I apologize for disrupting your day. You deserve to know the person you were committing your life to. What you do with that knowledge is, of course, entirely your decision." With that, I walked steadily toward the exit my purpose accomplished. Behind me, I heard the growing murmur of conversation, Sophia's voice raised in further questioning James's increasingly desperate attempts to salvage the situation. Thomas and Sarah caught up with me in the lobby, both looking slightly stunned by what had transpired. "Mary, that was the most dignified act of justified vengeance I've ever witnessed," Thomas said, helping me with my coat. "It wasn't vengeance," I replied, surprised, to realize I meant it. It was simply truth. Something that's been in short supply in James's narrative for far too long. We left the hotel together, stepping into the bright afternoon sunlight that seemed somehow cleaner, clearer than before. I did not stay to witness the full aftermath of my revelation, but over the following weeks, the academic grapevine brought news. The wedding had not proceeded after my departure. Sophia had removed her engagement ring and left with her parents after a heated private conversation with James. The Montgomery Foundation had withdrawn a major funding commitment to the department. Most significantly, an ethics investigation had been launched into James's academic practices, prompted by colleagues newly emboldened to speak about patterns of appropriation and misrepresentation. By Christmas, James had resigned his position and left Boston for a much less prestigious appointment at a small college in the Midwest. The department chair position he had been positioned to assume went instead to a junior faculty member known for her ethical standards and collaborative approach. I received numerous calls and emails from former colleagues, some apologetic for their silence during James's campaign against me, others simply expressing admiration for my courage in speaking truth to power. I accepted their words graciously while recognizing that my worth no longer depended on their validation. My life now bears little resemblance to my former academic existence. I teach literature at the community center 3 days a week, guiding adult students who bring life experience to their reading in ways that continually refresh my own perspectives. My book has found an appreciative audience outside traditional academic circles. I mentor young women writers through a program I established with a small inheritance from my mother. Most importantly, I have reclaimed my voice and my sense of worth. James was wrong about so many things, but perhaps most fundamentally about the nature of relevance and value. True worth doesn't come from positions or titles or even recognition. It comes from integrity, from using one's gifts in service of truth, from treating others with dignity even when it offers no strategic advantage. Sometimes I think about that letter now tucked away in a drawer I rarely open. It served its purpose not as a weapon, but as a mirror that reflected truth in a moment when truth was desperately needed. I keep it not as a reminder of betrayal, but as evidence of my own transformation from victim to truth-teller, from someone silenced to someone who found her voice when it mattered most. Have you ever faced a situation where speaking your truth was difficult but necessary? How did you find the courage to stand up for yourself after being made to feel small? I believe that our most powerful moments often come when we reclaim our dignity after someone has tried to take it from us. If my story resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to hear more stories of resilience and redemption, and give this video a thumbs up if you believe in the power of truth over convenient fiction. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember that your worth is never determined by those who fail to see it.